One of my favorite things that Student Venture does is a target group outreach. Now, this is a very significant term and very interesting. We would use this term because what you're doing is you're going to target a group and then do an outreach to that group. So it's a target group outreach.
Target group outreaches are one of the biggest ways that we get students involved on a campus ministry. And so what we see is that when you go on a campus and we've learned to map out a campus, and we've learned to kind of figure out, okay, what groups of kids what kind of groups are the kids hanging out in? And what we've recognized is that it's easier to reach a peer group, and it's easier to reach a natural group of people. And so we see that a lot in like the sports teams or the band, or even just different clubs, that we can go to those groups already, and the groups are already there and they're formed, and then we can do a target group outreach to them.
Just a couple years ago, I met a student who went to my church. He was a junior on the football team. He was on the varsity team, and we had not done anything at this campus. The only thing we had done on this campus is introduce ourselves to the principal and kind of said who we were, and that, we're praying about, we had been praying about how we can serve the community, and we just kind of came into them with the posture of, we're here to help. Let us know if we can assist you in any way. So I met this young man, Andy, who is the son of my Sunday school teacher at my church. And so we got together and started talking, and I just kind of cast a vision for Andy. And I said, what if all the guys on your football team would have an opportunity to say yes to Christ, just like you were given? And he thought that was a pretty neat idea. I'd never really looked at his football team that way. I said, well, let's get together again. Is there anybody on your football team that you think maybe is a believer that knows Christ and would be interested in talking more about this? And so he brought a guy named Trey, who was also a junior on the team. Me and Trey and Andy would meet, and we'd just kind of dream. And what would this look like? And how could we get the gospel to your entire team? About a week or so later, I approached the coach for an opportunity just to speak to the team and ask if I could be a resource in any way, if there's anything. And he had a few things that he wanted to talk to the team about, and I said, well, yeah, I'd love to be able to do that. And I think about a week later, I came in to the locker room. It was after practice, and was able to speak to the whole team. It was maybe a 5 to 7 minute kind of talk. It was secular. I didn't mention God or anything like that. But having met with Trey and Andy a few weeks before, we had planned that whenever I could speak to the entire team, that they would use that opportunity then to invite all the guys out to an outreach event that we were going to do. And so we had flyers made up, and I spoke, and then after I was done speaking, they passed out flyers to everybody on the team, those two guys, and invited them out to what we did, a Viking dinner, which was a big 20-foot by 20-foot tarp and 3 coolers full of spaghetti. And what we did was, it was like 2 days later, these guys were invited out after practice. There was a big field, and I got permission to use this field. And we spread the tarp out, and we dumped all this spaghetti in the middle of the tarp. And it was, basically stripped down to your shorts, T-shirt or no T-shirt, and just dive in the food. It was a kind of a Viking dinner, and I had Viking helmets and swords, and we had games and prizes. Andy shared a little bit about his testimony, about how he came to Christ. And so it was a peer talking to his teammates. And then I had another guy from the community who was, I'd found out he was on the championship football team from that school when they won state. And so he came out and spoke and shared the gospel. And through that event, Andy and Trey's junior year, they saw 8 of their friends on the team come to know Christ. And so they started meeting every week for Bible study. We would meet. At the team talk, we had something to invite them to, and that was the outreach. And at the outreach, we were already had in mind the very next meeting we were going to come together for kind of a follow-up group. We didn't call it a follow-up group, but kind of an investigative group. I call it, a lot of times with athletes, I call it, you want to come to the total athlete study, mentally, physically, and spiritually. at the Viking dinner, we invited them out to that, and then made sure that we contacted all of those students in the process, and using some social media as well, inviting them to be part of a Facebook group, and then also texting, putting students on some text. So all different ways to keep in contact with the student, and in hopes that they would come to that next kind of study. And the students that came out to that, we challenged them to say, hey, would you meet after school for the next 4 weeks? And so it's incremental challenges to a student. So at the team talk, it's would you come to the outreach? Well, they didn't call it an outreach, but would you come to the Viking dinner? That was their next challenge, And at the Viking dinner, would you come to the Total Athlete Study? Just check it out. And then those that came that first time, we said, there might be some guys that didn't make it today. See if they would come next week. And would you guys commit to the next 4 weeks? And then at the end of those 4 weeks, to kind of challenge, has this been something that has been helpful in your life? Has God used this in your life to grow you? And would you commit for this next quarter? Or would you commit for the semester to meet every week? And those incremental challenges to say, would you continue to come? And over the time, and then we would do, as we meet with them, do some really foundational Bible studies to help a new Christian grow in their faith. And then challenging them to say, now that Christ has done this work in your life, are there students that you know that are lost and they're dead in their sin? And how can God use you? Casting that vision again, how can God use you to be a part of communicating the gospel to them? The beauty about the target group strategy is that if you only have a day a week, you can pick one group and say, this is the group I'm trusting that the Lord's going to bring to Himself, into a relationship with Himself. And you can begin to pray for them by name and just that one day a week pursue that group. And trust that as a result from reaching that group, you'll have a group of disciples that you can continue to minister to. And from that day a week, even if that's all you ever have, God will use those disciples to reach other groups around the campus. And it kind of becomes that beachhead in which everything started. And that was my experience with Andy and Trey. It was my experience that's because all I had at that school at the time was one afternoon a week. And I said, with one afternoon a week, what do you want to do on this campus? And God used that, brought in a local person, Ryan, who was an adult in his mid-20s in the community who didn't have any connection with the high school, and birthed something at a school. There's one student, not that year, but the next year, named Luke. He was a sophomore on the team when those guys were juniors, and his junior year is when he received Christ, because they did the Viking dinner the next year. And then Luke, by the time track season came around, was the student that shared his testimony, the story of how God changed his life, just that previous fall, to his whole track team. And we did a big banana split for his track team. And all I could ever give that campus was a day a week. And for one semester, it was like a day a month is all I could give to that campus. But God had used that one. So, if all you have is an afternoon a week, I would say this is a great strategy that's in place that God will use to multiply beyond what you could even imagine.